Hi,
Hi.
how is everyone? Don't answer me. You're not supposed to be talking. No, you can answer me. You can answer me in the chat. I am the only one on mic right now, but that will not be. I'm here to welcome you. My name is Joanne Jarvie. I'm the Director of Outreach and Market Communications for MiHIN. And you are joining us today for the Download, which is our monthly webinar diving into the intersection of technology and healthcare, which is where MiHIN sits in the middle. Welcome. Next slide, please. What is MiHIN? MiHIN is a nonprofit organization. We are the state designated entity for health information exchange in Michigan. We are here as a third party. We are here as an unbiased data trustee. We build and support an infrastructure created for the purposes of getting access or gaining people access to data that any one organization or any one any one person needs to solve a problem. So when we talk about health information exchange, it's about getting access to the data that one needs to understand a problem of interest. We sit between the state of Michigan, we sit MDHHS, we sit between health payers, hospitals, primary care physicians, pharmacists, clinics. You'll see this is our role, and it's a pleasure. Today, you will be lucky not to hear from me. You will be lucky to be hearing from our Chief Policy and Privacy Officer, Shreya Patel, who is a lawyer who graduated from the University of Michigan with her Juris Doctor from Michigan State University College of Law. She, in her role, routinely examines the effect of national and state initiatives on interoperability and participates in national dialogue surrounding TEFCA and the final interoperability rules from the ONC and CMS. Shreya, you should also note, is an advocate of balancing public health interests and greater information sharing with patient privacy. And in turn, she leads our efforts surrounding the sharing of behavioral health information and electronic consent solutions to provide healthcare consumers with the ability to receive quality coordinated care in a secure and private environment. So today will be Shreya's show. That's who you'll be hearing from. A little bit more about MiHIN. Why do we need health information exchange? Well, the goals of health information exchange are pretty, you know what, they're pretty bold. We're here to move data for the purpose of health, of good health, for the purpose of public good, for the purpose of, like I said, getting anyone access to the data they need to solve their problem of interest, to understand more about their problem of interest. We are here to act and to protect and to collaborate to see the impacts would be improved access to healthcare, reduced infrastructure costs, reduced inefficiencies, lower healthcare costs. But mostly, you know, we're constantly sort of saying to ourselves, how do we support our stakeholders as they look to enhance patient safety and prevent medical errors? How do we support our stakeholders to get ahead of technological advancements and navigate and adopt the changing healthcare regulations and policies? Well, this is one of the ways that we do that. We have assets here whose job and whose roles are to do this and to look out for our stakeholders, to make sure that what we're offering is providing value now and that we're designing our technological infrastructure to support this going forward. So Shreya's she's not going to do too much legalese here. This is going to be review of policies and how they translate into technological solutions. MiHIN sits between a bunch of different learning health system sectors. And we share information between disparate members of this ecosystem. And here you'll see sort of, you know, this is at scale. We're doing this in the billions, and it's happening all the time. 24 hours a day. Next slide. This is just a really simple picture. This is sort of like before. Let's have everybody connect to everybody all the time with really pricey, solutions, or maybe connect once and have it go through a network to get to the people, to get the information to the people and the providers that need it for treatment or payment or operations. Next slide. That's all I've got for you today. If you have any more questions, I'm going to put my email in the chat. I am always available. I should be your first step to finding out who you should talk to, any one of our good subject matter experts at MiHIN. And here, without further delay, I'm really thrilled to introduce Shreya. Shreya, take us through what these policies have meant and what we're doing to support our stakeholders through these, through these changes.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction, Joanne. I appreciate that. And as she said with that, I'm just going to jump into my slide deck. As Joanne mentioned, I'm going to be covering about a year or so in policy initiatives in the interoperability space. And these are predominantly going to be subject areas that we have done deep dives into. So the purpose of the presentation today isn't going to be going into everything in extreme detail, but more so covering some quick summaries and then examining overarching themes or areas of importance, as well as what we can do or what you can do just to be proactive in these areas of importance. So here I have laid out the 5 themes that I'm going to cover in today's presentation, and they are going to be national interoperability, information blocking, behavioral health, cross-sector data sharing, FHIR, or the Fast Healthcare Interoperability resource. So the first topic that I'm going to cover is going to be this idea of national interoperability. And ultimately, it's very difficult to discuss this topic without a mention of the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, also known as TAFCA. And we have talked about TAFCA a lot over the past 7 years. We have had dedicated stakeholder meetings on this topic annually, if not twice a year, from the moment that the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, or the ONC, first started releasing drafts. So this might not be entirely new to you, but for those who aren't aware, this is a framework put forth by the federal government to enable national interstate exchange in the electronic healthcare space. And it was derived from the 21st Century Cures Act, which really strove to modernize the way that healthcare records were exchanged. So the main goals for implementing this framework is to have a universal policy and a technical floor for interoperability. It's to simplify connectivity and build on the health information exchange work that's already been done. And then also to find a way to connect individuals directly so they may be able to gather their own information. And it should be noted that this last goal was a new one that was added just within the past couple of years as patient access has become a big priority in the payer space, but also just in the healthcare privacy space in general. So this is generally what the framework would look like, with the ONC collaborating with an RCE, or Recognized Coordinating Entity, which we now know is the Sequoia Project. Underneath, we have connected qualified health information networks who all meet a common set of legal and technical requirements, and they're going to be the ones governing exchange for participants and sub-participants that are connected to them or that fall within them. And there are kind of 4 main components that make up this framework. So the first one is going to be that common legal agreement. The second are operational policies, which they called standard operating procedures. And those ones contain flow down terms for participants and sub-participants. So it's not just going to be applicable to the QHINs in the framework. The third one is the framework itself, which is just a set of principles that govern national exchange. And then most importantly, you're going to have something called the QHIN technical framework, which functions for the most part like a combination of 2 of our use cases that we have already. And the first one is the intelligent query broker. And the second one is just a typical push use case. A good example of that would be like our ADT use case. So what are the recent developments? Why did we include this for the past year in terms of themes? And as I mentioned, although we've kind of been discussing, TEFCA at length for the past 7 years, this is actually the first year that we have received final documents that dictate how this framework is going to work. In addition to that, the ONC and Sequoia have begun to accept applications for QHIN status, and they actually have accepted their first group of 6 provisional QHINs with 3 more that have an intent to apply. Second, we start to see these provisional QHINs start to reach out to their stakeholders to ask them to either opt in or out of their QHINs. So there's going to be a lot more movement happening there as well. And then third, and kind of like piggybacking off of this last bullet, there has been a variety of standard operating procedures published. And this is really important because for these entities that are making that decision to opt into this voluntary framework and opt into these QHINs, there is going to be a very long list of flow down terms. Each of the participant organizations are also going to be subject to. So we like to caution entities and let them know that they should really do their diligence before making decisions on this, because it would require them being compliant with those things, at the moment that they opt in for the most part. So this matters to us for a variety of reasons. The most obvious one is that we are going to naturally want to extend the existing work that we're doing in the HIE space and accommodate interstate exchange for an increasingly mobile population. But it's going to go well beyond that as well. So we initially understood this to be an entirely voluntary framework. And while it still is, what has changed over the past year is we're seeing TEFCA mentioned more and more frequently in federal interoperability rules as an option for compliance with other initiatives. So an example of this is using the TEFCA framework to meet the bidirectional exchange measure for MIPS, or the Merit-Based Incentive Program. Or another example would be using the framework to meet the conditions of participation for sending ADTs. So you are going to see this come up in other rules, and that's kind of the reason why I've listed this as a theme. It's also going to be important because of all of the exchange purposes, or as we call them, use cases that it contemplates. So while this framework puts forth more straightforward uses for exchange, like treatment and payment and healthcare operations, it also proposes national public health exchange, benefits government determination, and individual access service. And this is going to be a big deal because what we've noticed is certain QHINs have stated participation in these use cases may be limited to their network if an organization opts in. And that basically means that all queries and all pushes for that specific use would have to go through the QHIN. And the last reason that's going to matter is because it's going to be something that my next theme is going to cover, and that's many see participation in the TEFCA framework as a way to prevent information blocking claims from being brought against them because they would be connected to this larger framework. Before I move into information blocking, and I will say I'm going to reserve the Q&A portion until the end of my presentation, but I did want to circle back to our specific intentions and participation in the TEFCA network. So through MiHIN's affiliated organizations, we still plan to apply to become a QHIN and are actively working on completing a QHIN application in this calendar year. But we have intentionally delayed our application process, and the reason for that has been twofold. So first, because this is such a new framework and because there's still so much uncertainty in the framework today, we determined it'd be better to wait until more of these outstanding questions have actually been answered and we've seen how they've been resolved in practice. And then second, we're working on some updates to our technology platform to occur later this year, and those would greatly support national exchange. So that's another reason why there hasn't been faster movement on this. But again, we do intend to be actively involved in this framework. So now we're going to move on to information blocking. And information blocking is, again, going to be an initiative to come out of the ONC, or the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. And this rule basically prohibits actors from engaging in practices that are likely to interfere with the access, the exchange, or the use of electronic health information. So the three sets of actors that are subject to this rule are going to be healthcare providers, which is used very, very broadly and covers almost all of our stakeholders aside from state entities and payers. The second one is going to be health information networks or exchanges or entities like us. And then the third one is going to be certified developers or developers of certified technology as defined under the ONC Health IT certification program. So what has garnered the most interest in this rule isn't the general sentiment of do not block information from being shared, but more so these defined exceptions that the ONC has posed, all of which that I've put on the screen. Some of them are a lot more straightforward, and those are going to be ones such as preventing physical harm due to a security or privacy interest, infeasibility, fees, or for some system maintenance or downtime related to maintenance. But some of the others are a little bit more complicated. And one of them is content and the manner exception, which I'm going to expand a little bit more on in just a second when I go through some of our comments on the newest proposed rules related to information blocking. So as an actor subject to this rule, we've been very heavily involved in the information blocking dialogue, and we put together a variety of resources such as an information blocking regulation crosswalk, summary documents, a frequently asked question, as well as a sample policy for stakeholders to use internally. But it is worth asking why this rule that went into effect in 2021 is coming back up into the conversation. And the reason for that is because enforcement parameters were released this year, and we found out that actors could be subject to up to $1 million in fines if they're found liable for information blocking. It's really notable, though, that the Office of the Inspector General, who's going to be in charge of enforcement, is actually going to be the one who's the final determiner of if a claim will be brought against an actor or not. So other entities can report instances or occurrences to them of information blocking, but it's not going to be that direct legal action that occurs. Still, though, we do think it's essential to stay compliant with this rule, and we are dedicated to helping entities do that. So I did want to touch on just a few areas in which we as your HIE can help with compliance. The first one is a little bit obvious. It's that participation in our network alone does show good faith in exchange with a variety of participants, but we're also happy to go one step further and assist with some internal flows or documentation surrounding how participation in our network can actually help you remain compliant when you receive a request to share information. From our perspective and from the working groups that we've participated in, it really appears that documentation that displays uniformity and how we're responding to requests has been entirely key to this initiative. So we encourage you all to do the same, and feel free to reach out to myself or Joanne if you have any other questions on how we can help support with this particular initiative. Now, as I mentioned, the last thing I wanted to touch on is we did submit comments in this most recent proposed rule on the content and manner exception. Specifically, this proposed rule came out a few months ago, and I believe we submitted comments earlier in June. So currently, the content and manner exception may be used when an actor limits the content of its response or the manner in which it fulfills its response. But under this new proposed rule, there was a proposal to limit the use of this exception to only when there's a technical inability to provide a response. And further, the new proposal overlooked the fact that there may be instances in which certain information may actually only be sent out in a specific format for a reason. So it was really discounting areas where efforts being made, and there is just this inability to use that exception in the way that the previous language allowed for. So we've continued to actively engage in this discussion on behalf of our participant organizations to prevent any claims on us or you guys as well. But if you want a copy of our comment submission, please feel free to reach out to us, and I'm happy to provide that to you all if you want to advocate separately on this, or if you want to advocate on conjunction with us. What we really want to do here is we want to make sure that we understand the way that these exceptions are being used, but also the way that we'll be held to certain standards if a claim is brought against us. And this was one exception that didn't make the most sense in practice. So now we are going to get into a few more specific subject areas, the first of which is behavioral health with a focus on 42 CFR Part 2 information specifically. On this slide, I've just outlined some of the more frequent questions on part 2 to answer before jumping into the changes that we've seen over the past year. So 42 CFR Part 2, or in its abbreviated form, Part 2, is a federal regulation that actually preceded HIPAA and protects the confidentiality of substance use disorder records that come from defined Part 2 facilities. This regulation is in place to prevent from the stigma and the discrimination that can come from other entities or individuals finding out that you've received treatment at a Part 2 facility, which was at the time that it was enacted and still continues to be a very valid and real concern today. We receive questions all of the time asking about the difference between behavioral health information more generally and Part 2 information. And the way that I like to describe it is that behavioral health is this large overarching umbrella that covers many types of information. So it could cover mental health information, substance use disorder information, more general or from general medical facilities, as well as information from defined substance use disorder facilities, the latter of which would be Part 2 information. So Part 2 is just going to be one small part of the giant behavioral health bucket. And one of the biggest misconceptions that we kind of hear from participant organizations on this is that all behavioral health information falls into Part 2 and that behavioral health information is not able to be shared at large without consent. And the reason that that's a misconception is from what SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration guidance, has provided for us, we don't actually find that to be true. If behavioral health information is shared from a more general medical facility, SAMHSA said that that's not Part 2 information and can be shared in the same way that other information is shared under HIPAA, but only when it's from those defined Part 2 facilities should we ensure that consent is in place by the individual. And then lastly, when it comes to what has changed, there have been a few changes to Part 2 over the past year in which a proposed rule was put forward that would align Part 2 a little more closely with HIPAA itself. So right off the bat, the first thing that I like to make clear is that the new proposed rule for Part 2 did not take away any of the requirements that consent is needed prior to sharing Part 2 information, but it did clarify that consent can be a lot more simple and straightforward than we previously thought. One single consent can be ongoing and it doesn't need to be expired as we previously believed, which brings down a really big barrier for sharing Part 2 information. And that's that need to constantly collect and recollect consent. Another thing that did is it also aligned language on redisclosures, accounting of disclosures, and notice of privacy practices with HIPAA and gave very detailed guidance and best practices on how this would function moving forward. So to get back into the details of why this matters and how we can support it, it matters because it breaks down a barrier to sharing Part 2 information by making it a lot more simple. And it also aligns with HIPAA, which does away with any sort of conflicting language or confusion on compliance when we have multiple regulations that can sometimes be converse to one another. Now, when it comes to how we can support on this, our e-consent use case is a great tool that can be used to capture consent at the Part 2 facility, which again is still going to be a requirement that will need to be in place. I also encourage you all to engage in collaborative forums and presentations done by Van Lee, who is leading the e-consent effort, because he'll be able to really delve into how our product is adapting with changes in the regulation, how we're going to be able to update our internal practices as time goes on, and if necessary, how this is going to impact our existing use cases or new use cases from a technology standpoint. So an example of that is, if privacy tags or segmentation needs to be considered, he can go into a lot more detail in those larger forums on why we are or why we are not pursuing certain solutions. Now, I did want to very briefly touch on cross-sector data sharing as a key federal priority over the past year. And by cross-sector data sharing, I mean sharing healthcare information in a bidirectional manner with community-based organizations or actors who are not typically classified in the healthcare space, but ones that still do have important information for preventative purposes or need important healthcare information. So our program manager for cross-sector data sharing, Lisa Nicolau, has been doing incredible, very groundbreaking work over the past year in areas such as sharing social determinants of health information or sharing with actors outside of the typical healthcare space, such as with schools. But another program manager we have, Adam Giroux, has also been engaged very heavily in health equity work and the use of clinical quality initiatives for population health management. So we really just wanted to highlight how this work was prompted or in a way brought forward from a more federal perspective. So what was the policy driver here? So we saw this prominently come to the forefront last year with the 2023 Hospital Inpatient Prospective Payment System Rule, or IPPS, and the Long-Term Care Hospital and Prospective Payment System Rule, or LTCH PPS. These rules were published by CMS, and they usually are annually. And as the name suggests, these rules prospectively set base payment rates for certain services or certain items. They matter a lot to us and our stakeholders because typically these prospective payment system rules usually propose changes to hospital reporting requirements, and those dictate how entities will receive Medicare funding for that year and subsequent years, depending how readily and well they meet certain metrics. So making sure that we're compliant with this is definitely going to be a very big deal for us. So last year, they covered many topics from maternal health and tribal health to climate change, but three areas that stood out the most and were mimicked in other rules was the emphasis on health equity, social determinants of health, and health-related social needs. On the health equity side, CMS really wanted to see a hospital commitment to health equity measure, which prioritizes equity generally, but also encourages improved data collection, data analysis, quality improvement, and leadership engagement from hospitals as well. These rules also wanted to examine how social determinants of health could be attributed to clinical and non-clinical factors, which supports similar regulatory efforts to bring SDOH information into the HIPAA realm so that it can be shared a little more readily. And this is going to kind of be that link where we see it break out from just being a subject that's covered in a proposed or a final rule on cross-sector data sharing to becoming more of a common thread or a common theme in the federal interoperability space when we see some of that same language mimicked or repeated in various rules. So while we did submit comments last year on this rule and plan to do so again for the recent changes in September, what I wanted to emphasize in this theme and on bullet 3 of this slide is our work on interpretation and really receiving clarity on sharing information with community-based organizations for social determinants of health and health-related social needs. So as I previously mentioned, HHS does have a proposed rule out on changes to the HIPAA privacy rule, which would clarify if and how to share information with CBOs. But we have been very proactive and collaborating in multiple forums this year to really answer the question of how best to share this information across our network so that hospitals are able to meet this measure more easily and other healthcare stakeholders are also able to exchange this information. And this has been a really tough conversation because it requires legal interpretation, and many organizations and their attorneys differ on how to interpret the language and the guidance that HHS has put out thus far. But by really bringing forward these collaborative working groups, we've been able to at least dictate how to reach a common area of understanding that's at least functional for information exchange so that exchange can occur sooner rather than later. And this is going to be important because it allows us to move forward with these initiatives without being so dependent on the release of final rules. We're at least able to come to that uniform agreement on what this all means and kind of have these common rules of the road. And the last topic that I'm going to cover is FHIR, or the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource. And this is going to be the one topic that I'm going to do just a little bit more of a deep dive into because this is going to be the one that's a little bit more forward-facing. So before I get into the substance of what these new rules proposed, I included the next 2 slides just to provide a little bit of background and ensure we could discuss both of these in the larger legislative landscape. So this first slide outlines the 21st Century Cures Act, which I did reference before in regards to TEFCA. And it's basically a very comprehensive healthcare bill that was released by Congress in 2016. And it's going to be important because many of the requirements that come out related to healthcare interoperability, particularly in the health information network, health information exchange space, come from one small section within this bill. And this section gives agencies like CMS and ONC the ability to place requirements on the interoperability space. And it's going to be increasingly important because it drives a lot of the funding for that space as well. So I've highlighted on this slide a couple examples of mandates that have been derived from the legislation. And those are going to be ones such as the patient access rule, which required payers to give individuals access to their own healthcare information as facilitated by open APIs and third-party mobile apps. And we're going to go into a lot more detail in just a second after finishing this background on how that's been expanded on. This next slide has a timeline that just gives you a snapshot on all of the monumental releases that came out of the 21st Century Cures Act since its release in 2016. And while we're going to see some familiar ones that I've gone over in this presentation, such as information blocking, conditions of participation for encounter notifications, which as a reminder, just compelled hospitals to send those notifications for admissions, transfers, and discharges, and also the prospective payment rules. The purpose of the timeline is to really illustrate the importance of the Cures Act and just show how that one little section has prompted these multiple activities and will probably continue to do so in the years to come. So now that I've gone into what the Cures Act is and its significance, I wanted to delve into what is going to be emphasized in the future. And if there is one overarching theme that we've seen come out of the 21st Century Cures Act these past 7 years, it is that the future of interoperability lies in FHIR, or the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource. And just as a quick refresher, FHIR is a standard that defines data formats, elements, and APIs or application program interfaces. The main goal of FHIR is just to ease the complex barriers that exist for healthcare interoperability. And as such, I've just included a few advantages of FHIR on this slide, such as availability of a standard for data querying, introduction of an open standard for all healthcare data, widespread support from major entities such as health information exchanges and health information networks like us, vendors such as Epic and Cerner, as well as government entities as well, and some other advantages such as the fact that FHIR resources provide building blocks for modular frameworks, it uses modern internet technologies and protocols, and then lastly, there is that ability to link FHIR resources together to really tell the story that you want to tell from an interoperability standpoint. Just to tie this together, while we started with 21st Century Cures, its importance and the initiatives that have come out of it, what we found to be the theme of the last year is that we need to focus on FHIR. And in the next few slides, I'm going to delve into why that is. So in 2023, CMS released a new proposed rule for payers specifically, and not all payers, but named payers in the rule. So the new CMS rule is largely seen as an expansion of the CMS patient access rule that was released in 2020. And the reason for that is that CMS really wants payers to build and expand on the FHIR-based exchange that they have required these past few years. But it is notable that it's not considered an expansion because they are only enhancing patient access for individuals. In fact, it's going to be the opposite. So CMS wants payers to work on 3 entirely new activities using FHIR. So the first one is they want affected payers to be able to build a fully integrated FHIR API, which can automate the prior authorization process by pulling elements that are required for a specific service or item directly from the medical record. Second, they want payers to use FHIR bulk data access to require previous and concurrent payers to exchange information on an individual. And the purpose of this is really to build a longitudinal record on individuals as they move from payer to payer. And then third, they want to create, a FHIR-based API for provider access that is very akin to the patient access API and provides a lot of that same information to the providers, but it would really leverage us as a health information network to ensure that the appropriate patients are attributed to a provider before that sharing actually occurs. So the big question after hearing all of that is probably, does this affect us? And if so, how? And I would say this affects us in two different ways. The first way is that it allows us to leverage our interop station, which is our payer solution for the patient access mandate, and expand the work that we are doing with the payer community to help our existing customers meet these rules. And then the second reason, which I haven't listed, but I think is worth noting, is the prevalence of FHIR in these interoperability rules. So as I mentioned, it's really clear CMS and other agencies do see FHIR-based exchange as the future of health information sharing. So kind of building out our FHIR-based solutions might be worth our time, our resources, and our efforts. Now, when it comes to gaps or areas that are going to require our attention, there are a few that I've listed because they're going to require a very substantial technical lift to help entities comply with these requirements. So if we choose to do so, it'll require building that fully integrated party or prior authorization requirements, documentation, and decision API. It will require us to begin contemplating FHIR bulk data access for peer-to-peer exchange and setting up that entirely new API for the provider access API. But that's not even going to be just the extent of it. So as I mentioned in the last slide, HIEs and HINs were listed as entities that could help to outline a provider payer attribution process for the provider access API. And the reason for this is that CMS doesn't want any providers who are not actively caring for a patient to be able to query and receive information on them. And this is an area where we can really leverage our active care service, which has kind of been the cornerstone of exchange for us for about 10 years. But with all that being said, because there's so much work required, this compliance date is quite a ways away in the future. So they are allowing 3 years before compliance is even going to begin, and likely even more time for when enforcement will begin. But I believe the date that they have listed is January 1, 2026. Now, I did want to briefly summarize how this is going to impact the provider community, particularly in regards to that party API and the provider access API. So from the party API or that prior authorization perspective, this is something that's going to greatly benefit providers because it should make it easier for providers to understand the prior authorization requirements by having those publicly available in a much more transparent manner via API. And it's also going to automate information sharing through that integrated API so that providers might not have to do so much of the work when it comes to finding and submitting information. Now, from the provider access API side, this is going to allow providers to have access to the same information that patients get access to under the patient access rule, which is going to be really helpful when coordinating care for their patient population. And just to relate this back to the prior authorization component, providers will also have the ability to view past approvals and denials as well. So undoubtedly going to be a great resource when it comes to care coordination. And because this is a rule that's predominantly geared towards payers, I just wanted to point out the explicit benefits that providers would also get from these initiatives and the work being done on them. So I know that I mentioned a lot of other topics, and this presentation definitely doesn't go through every single thing that has been covered over the past year. I've also listed a few other priorities that we've seen when it comes to maternal and reproductive health, patient privacy, and tribal health. And I believe that we have a few downloads that have already been dedicated to these topics or might be dedicated to these topics in the future. So if any of these are of interest to you, please let me know. But we just kind of highlighted the 5 that I went through for the purpose of today's conversation. So I will just pause here and open it up for any questions that have been asked, and hopefully I can get answers to some of those areas.
Thank you so much, Shreya. That was a lot. How are we all feeling? I saw that there were a couple questions in the chat, and I think one Nick had written about a rule being active. I think it was it the behavioral health rule? Is that what you were asking, Nick? Sorry, it was like I think it was during that time, if you're still around, if you want to, yeah. So the behavioral health rule, is it proposed or is it active now? Shreya.
That one is still in the proposed format, so it has not been finalized yet. They're probably still going through comments, which they have a legal obligation to respond to those. So they're probably going through the finalization process now. And then when the final rule is proposed, we'll see their responses to a lot of the comments that we submitted publicly. But I will keep you all up to date on that. And Joanne, once it's finalized, we can always come back to have another conversation with the download participants.
For sure. Yeah, I was just going to actually send people to your policy page, which we will continue to update. We have a question here. So I have a lot of our subject matter experts on the call. So I'm looking at you, my associates. Someone's asking about our interop station and how payers get access for the patient access API. Do we have an interop station subject matter expert on the call that might be able to answer that? Anyone? Who is currently using interop station? We have how many? We have a couple of payers, including the state of Michigan, I think.
Yeah, I believe that we have Blue Cross Blue Shield using this. I believe we have McLaren using this, and I believe some of our other customers in other states are also using our interop station as a solution at this time. But I can go ahead and see if I can get you a more comprehensive list of that from the product manager.
Thanks, Shreya.
Joanne, I also did see a question a little bit earlier on in the chat, which was asking the question of, has MiHIN applied to be a QHIN? That might have been before I gave a little bit of an update on that.
I think it was. You did a nice job answering, but it's worth mentioning again.
Yep. Yeah. So it would likely be one of our affiliated organizations that's going to apply to be the QHIN. With MiHIN, we really want to focus on making sure that our existing services and products are up to par and that we're serving all of our existing stakeholders within the state of Michigan as is. So all the work effort related to that national interoperability component will likely go to one of those organizations, but will equally have a very similar flow. And it won't really impact too much of the stakeholder participation, except it might just be one step removed. So if MiHIN is a participant organization, then all of our stakeholders would be sub-participants and subject to the flow down terms that sub-participants have. We do actually have a TEFCA addendum drafted and available for entities to sign if they are ready to do so, which kind of goes through what some of those responsibilities would be. And Joanne, I'm also happy to share that with organizations. Like I said, sometimes it feels like it's a little bit premature just because information isn't yet being exchanged across this framework, but because there are so many requirements, I do think it's good for everyone just to get ahead and understand what requirements would be imposed on them under TEFCA. So it's not something that they have to scramble to do when that time comes.
Thanks for the offer, Shreya. And I will make sure that our stakeholders know that they have that option.
Sure.
There was also a question here from Diane. Diane, you're free to come off mute if you'd like, but you were wondering if there was common elements of agreements that we've been able to achieve for cross-sector data sharing. I think you're kind of looking for like the themes, our learnings.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. And maybe I can take a first stab at this answer. And then Lisa, if I miss anything, feel free to come off mute and add on to anything that I might have missed. But in terms of this common understanding in the agreements when we're talking about the sharing of social determinants of health information, a lot of that dialogue and a lot of that conversation has really surrounded the legal interpretation on, is social determinants of health or health-related social needs information able to be shared under HIPAA? If not, what needs to be in place from a contractual standpoint in order for that information to be shared? Does this need to come from healthcare entities or business associates that are subject to HIPAA, or can it come from community-based organizations that are not typically covered under that regulation? And if they're not covered under that regulation, can they be brought under that framework through a contractual obligation? So it's been a lot of the questions around how can we make the data sharing space a little bit more inclusive across not just the healthcare space, but all of the other spaces that impact healthcare and that healthcare has an impact on. And I'll just pause there, Lisa. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in on that from the technical perspective, or do you think that we kind of covered it from your end?
It pretty well from our end, just trying to make that recognition of the value that entities outside of healthcare have, both in kind of the delivery of social care and the ultimate impact on individual health outcomes, and making it more accessible to everyone to be able to provide that information back as well. So no, I think you did a great job.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for weighing in on that.
For your question.
Well, I guess my understanding was that there was uncertain. I mean, HIPAA extends to healthcare organizations, so for other kinds of sharings, I mean, we're awaiting federal guidance, but since you've been able to make progress, I was just wondering what the themes of how you can, the great news about the common elements as a lesson for going forward, of the areas of agreement on those kind of uncertain areas, and how you've managed to achieve that, at least in a way that works for now, and if that could be lessons for the pressing needs that will come soon with the federal and state imperatives on social determinants of health sharing and health-related social needs.
I can take a stab at this. So Diane, I think what you're talking about is really kind of that recognition that those outside of healthcare don't have that treatment, payment, and operations relationship necessarily to healthcare entities like payers, providers, and hospitals. But all recognize that kind of ultimate impact that could be felt. I think that there is, because of that, meeting community and those outside of the typical HIPAA framework where they are, and with some guardrails around that data use, is, in my opinion, the biggest lesson that we have learned, and can be applied nationally as well. So, direct care coordination is something that the majority of organizations can really agree on in terms of usages for that data. A stepwise approach to data sharing agreements. As I think you've heard all of us say before, data movement really comes at the speed of trust, and taking that in a stepwise fashion is important.
Yeah, and Lisa, just to kind of piggyback off of what you're saying, and Diane, what might be helpful is we actually have kind of taken a approach that mimics what we've been seeing at the federal level. So one thing that we have learned, or one lesson that we've kind of taken from TEFCA and the way that it has evolved, is they very much so want community-based organizations as a part of their framework, and they want to be exchanging social determinants of health information. So in their standard operating procedures and in their larger common legal agreement, one thing that they have made very clear is that you're still able to participate, but if you're not an entity that is regulated by HIPAA. So if you're not a covered entity or a business associate of one, but you sign this legal agreement, you're agreeing to be bound by the same terms of the business associate agreement or of their legal agreement as all of the other entities that are subject to them. So they allow for a contractual agreement to be bound by that same set of rules. And that's kind of how you have that uniform legal and technical framework in place for the exchange of social determinants of health information. One thing that we can make available for you is the legal exhibit that we have put in place to advance the sharing of social determinants of health information. If it's of interest to you, you can kind of see how we've done what Lisa mentioned, which is put limitations on the sharing of information just to build that trust for right now and get community-based organizations connected through the framework. And then hopefully we can expand that as time goes on and as we get that guidance that we've been waiting on.
Shreya, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. The idea, that idea of a template makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it. Thanks, Lisa and Shreya.
Sure. Ooh.
Does anybody have any other questions? We have this is a very expensive meeting, turns out. We've got our best and our brightest on here. Definitely Shreya. So now is the time, really, if you want to come off mute, if you wanted to engage in a discussion. Did you hear what you came to hear? Did you learn what you came to learn? And if not, do you want to take the time now to try and dig? Now's your time. Damien, I see that you have your hand up. If you want to come up.
Have I been unmuted?
You have been unmuted. We hear you loud and clear.
Well, that's good. My name is Damien Kiska. I'm a senior interoperability solution architect with Roche Information Solution and somebody with deep roots in Michigan. One of the things that I think I heard you say, which I think is fascinating, is that instead of applying for QHIN right out of the box or right out of the gate, we've chosen to wait and see how it plays and such. I'm wondering if it might be that you don't choose to be a QHIN exactly, but that you might also consider having another one of your other organizations that you're associated with be the QHIN, and then you would just be one of the best feeds for that. Does that make any sense?
Yes, and that's exactly, I think, what we're contemplating. So we have an affiliated national organization named Velatura, and we believe that that might be a better fit for the QHIN status for a few different reasons. But the first one is kind of like I mentioned, that organization is more national focused, where MiHIN, we really want to ensure we're maintaining the quality of services, products, tools, and applications in the state of Michigan as time goes on. So that's kind of the reason why Michigan will definitely be connected to the network, and MiHIN will be connected to that network, but it might not be the actual QHIN, it might be a participant organization. And ultimately, that might be a positive thing for our stakeholders because they will now be sub-participants and therefore subject to less flow down terms. We're going to be taking on the bulk of all the compliance requirements, and the sub-participants are just going to be basically subject to the same rules that essentially govern their data sharing across our network currently.
That seems very wise to me, and I'm really glad that there's been this kind of evaluation to say, we don't necessarily need to be the QHIN of record as long as we're, and so I'm assured that as long as MiHIN is actively engaged and part of the QHIN network as such, that we'll be able to take advantage of all the good work that's been done by MiHIN.
Yeah, thanks so much for that feedback, Damien. I agree with you. I think that that's a good approach. And just one final thing, I know that you mentioned at the very beginning that we were kind of choosing to delay our application. The reason for that, it was twofold, like I mentioned, but just to also be very candid, as I mentioned, the first draft that we ever saw of TEFCA was released in 2016, and it has kind of been delayed in its final iteration until this year. And on top of that, it is a voluntary framework. So before we're able to determine all of the effects that this could have on us and our stakeholders, we just want to see how it's working in practice, and also just to make sure that we are set up to do that level of exchange as well. So thanks so much for your feedback, and let us know if you have any other questions on TEFCA in the future.
Thank you.
Looks like we have 4 minutes left. Diane, you're asking about a federal health data hub initiative. Shreya, is this on your plate?
I am not entirely familiar on what federal health data hub initiative you're referring to. Are you able to give any more context into that, or what the subject matter of that hub is?
Shreya, yeah, this is Diane. I've just read about and become a little exposed to the it seems to be a cloud-based platform, kind of a federal part of the movement toward differently transitioning information for better sharing. But we can take it offline. I can at least give you a link to what I found.
Okay. And is it by chance related to the data modernization initiative? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I think it's also coming out of ONC.
Oh, okay. Got it. Yep. Yeah, I will look into that further, and we can definitely touch base offline and then share with the other participants on the call what we end up finding out if it's of interest to you all.
Appreciate it.
Okay, Damien, your hand is still up. Do you have another question? No. He put it down.
I didn't
Okay.
realize I had to actively do that.
That's okay. Keep it up. I just won't call on you. Thank you all for coming to July's The Download. We are still planning out our next download. I do suspect it's going to be about our technological improvements, where we're going in the future with FHIR and our clinical data repository. And like you can see, we have really, really smart, sort of just the best in breed working for you here. Please take advantage. Thanks a lot. Feel free to reach out. Have a wonderful week.
Cheers.